Good morning, friends, and happy Wednesday. Today is day 38. We are nearing the end of our Bible study. Together, we're going to finish off Luke chapter 3 by reading verses 26 through 56 today. It's a very difficult passage, our most difficult by far. But I don't want it to leave you feeling discouraged because we know the rest of the story. And if you haven't read the rest of the story, let me promise you that hope is coming. So today, our sweet treat is that Jesus is forgiving. At the end of our passage yesterday, the crowd had insisted that Pilate release Barabbas instead of Jesus. And so Pilate, unfortunately and reluctantly, sent Jesus to his death. At this point, Jesus has been awake for at least 36 hours. He's been beaten and bruised and bloodied. He's under the mental, emotional, and spiritual stress of the trials and of his knowledge of what's to come. In this moment, he is more vulnerable and weaker than he has probably ever been in his life, and yet he is about to face the hardest thing that anyone has ever faced. As if his body has not already endured enough pain, Jesus is whipped as Pilate had promised. Jonathan Edwards, a preacher, theologian, and missionary in the 1700s, said this of Jesus's physical state. He said, "The severe scourging, with its intense pain and appreciable blood loss, most probably left Jesus in a pre-shock state. Moreover, hematidrosis had rendered his skin particularly tender. The physical and mental abuse meted out by the Jews and the Romans, as well as the lack of food, water, and sleep, also contributed to his generally weakened state. Therefore, even before the actual crucifixion, Jesus' physical condition was at least serious and possibly critical." It was customary for criminals to pick up the crossbar portion of the cross and carry it to the place of their crucifixion. Pastor David Guzik says that it would weigh anywhere between 75 and 125 pounds, and usually criminals were stripped of their clothes first, and then their hands are tied to the crossbar so that they are forced to make this march to their deaths naked and ashamed. Jesus is in such a weakened state that he isn't physically able to carry the crossbar. So after stripping him of his clothes, which reopened the wounds that had begun to dry and heal to the fabric, the Roman guards grab a man named Simon from the crowd and make him carry the crossbar for Jesus. As they are walking, women in the crowd begin to mourn and wail, but Jesus has words of warning for them. He tells them, "Don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves and your families. Weep for the people who are doing this to me. For the day is coming when your culture will no longer look down on women who are barren. When Jerusalem falls, you'll be saying that women who don't have babies are the ones who are blessed because they won't have to see their children suffering and tormented in this way. After all, if they do this to the innocent, can you imagine what they'll do to the guilty?" Verse 32 tells us that there were two other men there to be crucified with Jesus that day at a place called Calvary, just outside Jerusalem's city walls. Reverend Edwards said, although the Romans did not invent crucifixion, they perfected it as a form of torture and capital punishment that was designed to produce a slow death and maximum pain and suffering. I hate reading about what the crucifixion was like. I hate thinking about what Jesus willingly took in my place. But this story is so much more than words on paper. The story truly happened, and it happened because of me and my sin, and you and your sin. We owe it to Jesus to understand what his sacrifice meant. We owe it to his mercy to understand its extent. I could never adequately portray to you what Jesus went through. I'm definitely not a theologian or a Bible scholar. I never went to Bible college. I just love reading the Word of God and looking and digging and gleaning from the resources that other people have put together. So I want to read to you what Pastor David Guzik writes about the crucifixion itself. And I'm telling you, this is hard. The combination of scourging and crucifixion made death on the cross especially brutal. The victim's back was first torn open by the scourging, then the clotting blood was ripped open again, and the clothes were torn off before the crucifixion. the victim was thrown on the ground to fix his hands to the crossbeam, and the wounds on the back were again torn open and contaminated with dirt. Then as the victim hung on the cross, each breath caused the painful wounds on the back to scrape against the rough wood of the upright beam. When the nail was driven through the wrist, it severed the large median nerve. The stimulated nerve produced excruciating bolts of fiery pain in both arms and often gave the victim a claw-like grip in the hands. Beyond the extreme pain, the major effect of crucifixion was to restrict normal breathing. The weight of the body pulling down on the arms and shoulders tended to fix the respiratory muscles in an inhalation state and hinder exhalation. The lack of adequate respiration resulted in severe muscle cramps, which further hindered breathing. To get a good breath, the victim had to push against the feet and flex the elbows, pulling from the shoulders. Putting the weight of the body on the feet produced searing pain, and flexing of the elbows twisted the hands hanging on the nails. Lifting the body for a breath also painfully scraped the back against the rough wooden post. Each effort to get a proper breath was agonizing, exhausting, and led to a sooner death. In verse 34, Jesus ushers forth words of mercy in his final moments. He cries out, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." He pleads forgiveness for his own executioners. Once again, he shows us how to respond to hatred with love. While he's petitioning the Father for their forgiveness, the guards are rolling dice to see who would get his clothes. Jesus has literally stepped away from everything he owns, including his own clothing, and he's laying it all down for us. Luke says Jesus' religious enemies mock and sneer at him as he hangs on the cruel cross. They dare him to step down from the splintered tree he's nailed to in order to save himself. Ironically, they use the exact same language that Satan used when he was tempting Jesus in the wilderness. But once again, Jesus chooses not to give in. He chooses to save us instead. It's been said that it was his love that held him to the cross, not the nails. The soldiers mock him as well, offering him sour wine and writing an inscription above him that says, "This is the King of the Jews." The criminal on one side of Jesus goads him, saying, "If you're really Christ, then save yourself and save us too." But the criminal on the other side has had a significant encounter with Jesus there on the crosses. He says, "Do you not even fear God, seeing that you're under the same condemnation? And we deserve punishment for our sins, but this man has done nothing wrong." The man looks at Jesus and says, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus turns his battered head to the criminal and says, with raspy voice and wheezing lungs, "Assuredly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." I don't even know what that cost Jesus physically just to utter those words, but I know what it cost him physically in a way that would bring about an eternity for all of us. This is the only deathbed confession recorded in the Bible, and it's shared not to give us permission to wait until our final breath to receive Jesus as Lord, but instead to encourage us that it's never too late. The criminal on the cross did go to paradise that day with Jesus, but think of the life he wasted that he could have spent in service to God, in loving communion with God, in conversation with God. Suddenly, the bright daytime sky goes completely dark for 3 hours. Luke says the sun was darkened and the veil of the temple was torn in two. Now, a lot of people like to try to explain things, right, with science. And it was said that it would have been an eclipse of the moon or something like that. And yet it happened during Passover week, where there's always a full moon during Passover, and so that's not possible. So I love that God works out these details to prove, no, it was just him. So Luke says the sun was darkened and the veil of the temple was torn in two. Now in the temple, a thick curtain hung to separate the Holy of Holies from the holy place. If Remember, back to the beginning of Jesus's story, his mother Mary had a cousin named Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was married to a priest named Zechariah. And Zechariah was granted the opportunity to burn the incense before God in the Holy of Holies. So things have now come full circle, and when Jesus takes his final breath, the veil tears from top to bottom. God tears it from heaven down. Earth did not tear it from earth up. Why? Why does this matter? Because it's God that removed the barrier that separates us from him. Because that was the whole purpose of Jesus' birth, death, and soon resurrection. Luke says, Jesus then cries out in a loud voice and says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathes his last breath. A Roman army officer in the crowd watches the scene unfold, and he can't help but to glorify God, saying, certainly this was a righteous man. Everyone who loved Jesus is mourning his loss, completely forgetting his promise to rise again. A man named Joseph from the city of Arimathea is a Jewish council member present at Jesus' crucifixion. He had spoken against the decision to crucify him, but nobody had listened. So upon Jesus' death, Joseph approaches Pilate and asks for his body. Now, traditionally, the bodies of criminals would be left on the cross or taken down and just left on the ground for the animals to eat, for the birds to eat. But this was Passover, and the Jews really didn't want that up. They really didn't want people looking at that. And so when they came to Pilate and asked him, when Joseph came to Pilate and asked him for the body, Pilate willingly handed it over. Joseph wrapped Jesus in linen and places his body in a new tomb that had been cut out of rock. Because the Sabbath is near, Joseph and the women who had followed him from Galilee, they go about preparing Jesus's body for burial with spices and oils, which was customary at the time. But they have to do it quickly before the sun sets, because when the sun sets, it's technically the next day in Jewish time, and the next day would be the Sabbath. So they're trying to work quickly to get this done before the Sabbath. Once the sun set, the Sabbath officially began, and Luke tells us that they all rested according to the commandment. Today's sweet treat is that Jesus is forgiving. There upon the cross, where he had every right to forget us and save himself, he remembered you and he remembered me. And love held him to that cross. There, in his last moments, he pleaded for his Father to forgive those who held him there. He pleaded for the Roman soldiers. He pleaded for the Jewish priests. He pleaded for the crowd who kept calling, crucify him, crucify him. He pleaded for you and he pleaded for me. Jesus is forgiving. There is nothing that he cannot and will not forgive you for if you just ask. Hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you back here tomorrow for the good news.